Morning, I'm Sam Hartmann, VP Exploration of F3 Uranium. We are currently working on the Patterson Lake North project, which kind of encompasses two properties. We call it Minto, Broach, and Patterson Lake North. We discovered this high-grade, what we call the JR zone, in late 2022, where we've had some very high-grade intercepts. In the last year, we focused on fleshing out that zone, the mineralized area, and then also doing quite a bit of exploration. So I think in 2024, we drilled about just shy of 23,000 meters and 50 drill holes. This year is shaping up to be another busy year. It'll be somewhat smaller than last year, I would imagine. This winter, we're kind of looking at a $5 million budget for drilling and some geophysics as well to sort of bring new areas into the pipeline for drilling on those properties.
Brilliant. Sam, good to see you again, sir. Right, I wanted to talk today specifically around the drilling, the drill planning, what you've seen, what you want to get after. Let's get the whole F4 thing out of the way. Where are you at with that?
F4 is it's with the TSX. I think it's in the final stages, awaiting approval for listing. I think we should be able to get that pushed through, TSX pending within the next 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay.
So we should be trading fairly soon.
I have a lot of sympathy with you. I'm trying to do the same thing with our copper project. It's taken about three times as long as anyone said. Right, it is what it is. But let's get back to the drilling, okay? I want to talk about a few topics in terms of like resource growth potential, the drilling strategy, economic potential, and some of the challenges and mitigation strategies. But I'll kick off with regards to the JR zone extension. What are you have you got a sense of what you may be able to estimate in terms of tonnage or grade expectations based on the latest drill results?
I think that what we're looking at is it has a fairly limited strike extent. We're still at about 156 meters, or 165 meters rather. But what we're focusing right now on is sort of the very high-grade core of it. And typically what you see in these basement-hosted deposits in the basin is that about half your pounds typically are within the high-grade core.
Right.
So we see that as well. We call it the ultra-high-grade core, which is kind of like 20% plus, which is sort of like a sandwich in the middle of the deposit. We had one really great hole that we released late last year. That was hole 176, which was, 4.5 meters of 50%, basically true width. And I think this winter, we kind of want to flesh out the area around that with some tighter space drilling, and just to sort of give a bit more volume to those very high-grade areas and build pounds inside of that.
Okay, and how does 176 compare to some of the previous discovery holes?
Very good. I mean, it's our top hole. We have several holes that are in that range. For great thickness, you're looking at, I don't know what that is, close to 200. And yeah, that's basically how we're going to build pounds in JR zone, I think, is by defining very closely the very high-grade material. So what we want to now do is see in what directions we can expand that. There's several trends within the zone. The zone is, a flat thing. Within that, you have these high-grade chutes in a way. So we kind of want to delineate those and try to add pounds that way.
Right, but in terms of understanding, the conformity there, in terms of the resource, do you think is it expanding laterally or continue or at depth? I mean, with these chutes, where do they go and how do you find them?
And so usually the way you define them is you kind of keep stepping out from your node, right? And you got to be careful you don't build biases into your own thinking. Sometimes you sort of build a bias in and you follow the high grade and you think it's trending down, but really that's the way you're drilling it. I think right now for this winter, we are going to step out a little bit and try to pull the zone out as much as we can towards holes that are a bit unmineralized outside of the deposit and stretch it out. And at the same time, give us more drill density inside the high-grade core.
Right. So this drill density. What is that drill density that you're allowing you to kind of target? And
so initially,
when
we drill these things, you're looking usually at 15-meter section lines, and the drill holes kind of go off section. There's deviation. There's all kinds of stuff. I think right now we're down to about, on average, probably 12 to 15 meters drill density. And I think we'll increase that to probably around 8, especially in the very high-grade core. And that sounds very tight to a lot of people outside of the uranium industry of why drilling such tightly spaced drill holes. And that really comes down to the very extreme variability of grade and thickness you have in these deposits, because you can go from extremely thick, high grade to no mineralization at all over 10 meters very easily. So you kind of got to look at your grade distribution, and, the drill density will ultimately kind of be dictated by the nature of those deposits.
Right. I think, obviously Athabasca Basin, uranium deposits can be structurally complex, as you say, but apart from the drilling, how are you kind of redefining the kind of geological model to improve that targeting efficiency? Is there anything else that you're doing?
I think that and when you're looking at that sort of stage, or that holes that are that tightly spaced, you can look at, you're kind of past geophysics or anything like that, which is much broader than the level of drilling you're doing, right? So sometimes, you're drilling these holes, and it does feel like you're playing Battleship, and you're just kind of, is the high grade going this way or that way? You can look at, we collect hundreds of parameters on the drill core, structural lineaments and all kinds of stuff. And that helps you to a certain degree, but ultimately you just got to drill the holes,
Right. And are there any kind of geological controls on the mineralization at JRSM, which is kind of helping you sort of confidently predict the extensions?
No. So that's one of the challenges, especially at JR Zone, and probably most basement hosted deposits, they sit in these shear zones that are kilometers long. Why are they where they are? That's not as clear. I mean, we think there's cross-cutting structures. Ultimately, these things are so structurally complex that every hole has, tens and tens of faults and structures through them. And, that's what makes them fun to find. And that's why when you are on them, you kind of got to stick to tight drilling and kind of walk your way out.
Right. And say,
but there's no silver bullet of no magic trick you can really ultimately do to, sort of skip that process of tightly spaced drilling.
But given all of that, I guess there's probably less unexpected geological challenges in that sense. I mean, in terms of, you mentioned like faulting or water inflow or anything that could sort of complicate things in the future.
No, I think that, one of what's unique about the basin, especially the west side where we are, is that we have a significant thickness of overburden. So that's basically your glacial quaternary, we call it, overburden sand and gravel, and there can be up to a couple hundred meters of that. So usually the challenge there is to be able to drill through it and keep your drill hole straight enough to define your zone. We've kind of addressed all those challenges. We're pretty confident in our ability to drill these things off. Geotechnically, water inflow and anything like that, that's pre-feasibility level stuff that we're not really looking at. What we are doing, though, is we do collect pre-feasibility level technical data on all our drilling, just so that if it ever gets to that stage, we, are ahead of the game a bit.
So I think what I'm hearing is that there's a kind of degree of understanding where you go, well, maybe 50% of the value of this thing is in the heart of it, in terms of this, would you call it super high grade zone? And you with this kind of the step outs as you're doing them, you're kind of increasing the certainty of that discovery. But what does that do in terms of being able to make additional either find other satellite deposits or new discoveries completely? Does it negate that?
No, I don't think so. I think those are two separate issues completely. You have the zone drilling, and then you have exploration outside of that. We've spent quite a bit of time and capital on exploration along strike, because typically these deposits they're not these singular pods. They always kind of come, in multiple pods, because whatever geological circumstance there was to cause this thing to be in the shear zone located here, those similar circumstances would have existed elsewhere in these long structures. So you can expect more of the same opportunities for mineralization, right? And so we've been drilling basically along these shear zones. We get to one point where we have a massive cross-cutting fault that's perpendicular to it. And then sort of to the east of that is what we call B1. So everything's been dropped down. There's a massive fault. And on that area, we have basically the most amazing geochemistry that you can possibly look for over kilometers, right? We have uranium values and boron values and all that, but we haven't been able to actually find a new pod in there yet. And that's been it's been frustrating for us because based on what you see, there should be something very big down there, right?
Right. And what do you, I'll maybe come back to some of the economics in a second, but just sticking with the exploration and I guess target rationale, right? So, and again, we'll talk about B1 in a sec, but why was the A1 structure chosen for like immediate follow-up exploration? What was it about it?
Well, A1, so we originally drilled it in 2014 and we drilled it in 2019. And then we made the discovery in 2022. And it's hard to say because oftentimes you'll drill an exploration hole and you go in the core shock and you look at it and you can say, okay, this looks right. And it's hard to say why. It just looks good or it doesn't. A1 has always looked good. It looked very similar. The structure itself, where it wasn't mineralized, it looked very similar to what we saw at Patterson Lake South. So when you kind of compared the core boxes of the structure, they look basically the exact same. So
if you look at like hole 152, for instance, you know, it would return like 0.051, right? Over 7 meters, right? So what made that a priority target compared to some of the other holes, say?
That hole was basically targeting an extension of the A1 and the B1 conductors in the area of this cross-cutting fault. So it's an area where you have a lot of geological complexity and cross-cutting relationships of major structures. So that was just an interesting area based on that alone. And then that was substantiated with geophysics. There's a ton of conductivity in there as well. And then hole 152, you look at it, it's got meters and meters of fault. The alteration looks great. Geochemistry looks great. It looks like a hole that is a near miss to a deposit. That's what that hole looks like.
Right. Okay. If you look at the B1, right, it's kind of has those. It's in a sort of sandstone structure, right? Is that right?
B1 is the same as A1. It's this basement structure under a bit more sandstone than we have on A1. And when you have a bit more sandstone, it gives you a bit more leeway to see more alteration coming into the sandstone. So a bit of sandstone is a nice thing for exploration because it gives you a bit of a better indication of what you might have below.
Right, but it has some sort of pathway material in there, and something like boron, etc. I mean, again, so is that sort of typical of the area, or are there examples of that you talk about?
Boron is an element that's in clays and it's in a mineral called tourmaline, and usually boron is tightly associated with uranium, or I guess you can say uranium deposits are associated with boron. So high boron values is probably the best indicator and the most important pathfinder element, so to speak, for uranium exploration is boron.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, so what we had at B1, which we drilled last year and earlier on, was, values of 10,000 ppm boron, when what's anomalous would be anything probably over 3 to 500.
Right, okay. So given that, I mean, how many holes and meters are you planning on the kind of new test zones? And how do you plan to sort of allocate that drilling between A1 and B1 structures?
So for this program coming up, see, one of the issues that we're having is lab results. Right now, the results we're receiving from the lab are basically things that we've submitted in June and July of last year. So there's about 25 drill holes outstanding. A ton of that is in B1. And so it's like, do you go in and start follow-up drilling on holes that you don't have assays yet? Or is it more prudent to kind of wait till you get those and start targeting some other things, right? And that's kind of the boat we're in right now. I think we're going to start this program that is underway right now. We are going to start with following up on hole 152. We are going to do some drill holes in A1 and the JR zone more specifically, and that's going to be targeting more high grade. And after that, we are going to bring into the pipeline a couple new areas as well. that we're doing geophysics on right now.
Okay, well, it comes to that in a second. Just sticking with the A1B1. In terms of assays allowing, what's the expected time frame to determine whether A1 or B1 holds, significant uranium mineralization?
So, I mean, significant uranium mineralization is we get an indication of that right away just based on scintillometer counts, right? And gamma probes. So these drill holes that we've drilled and released, we already kind of know if there's significantly radioactive sections in those. And, that takes you quite a ways there towards what you want to follow up on. But you're just kind of missing the whole suite of geochemistry.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, coming back to the kind of geophysical surveys, like ground EM and airborne surveys, etc., in terms of, what role they play in sort of defining targets. I mean, given what information that you've built up to date, I mean, how confident are you in the geophysical surveys and their correlation with actually finding uranium mineralization?
Well, that's a tough one. I think that geophysics is very good at finding conductors, which are structures that are conductive, which tend to host uranium deposits, right? I don't think that geophysics can find specifically mineralized deposits or zones on themselves. You can sort of do, you do all kinds of geophysics, gravity, EM, resistivity. You can overlay them all. And then ultimately you look at where these deposits are after you have all this geophysics and in hindsight, and it's never as clear as you might think, right? It kind of correlates with that, but not really. It's in a conductive area, but not the most conductive area. So you kind of learn, I think you learn with every deposit you find and every survey you do on what you look for the next one. But yeah, our approach definitely, I think right now is ground EM, followed on airborne MT surveys.
Right, because I guess what I'm trying to get at is in terms of what you've done before and what you've learned and how does that affect things now. So, in terms of whether that be sort of, geological characteristics of A1 and B1 compared to JR zone or alteration patterns in A1 and B1, and where they're present in the JR zone before discovery, etc. So, is it easier now or is it as hard as it has ever been?
I think that it's never really easier. You got to be careful too, because just because JR zone is where it is doesn't mean the other ones, if there are other ones, that they're going to be hosted the same way, right?
Why? Explain that to people, because I've had it explained to me, I think, at Beaver Creek last year, and they'll be there. They're somewhere there, but they could be deeper. They could be much broader. So how does all that come together?
Well, that comes down to how we look at it and how we interpret the data. I think what we find is, like, we are doing ground EM right now at what we call PW Trend, which is in the southwestern portion sort of the property. And there's been historic geophysics there that was done, but the parameters for those surveys weren't done right. So we now are redoing it, and now we're identifying conductors in the area where there previously weren't any. And, those sort of new parameters are based on what worked on A1 and JR zone. So you do learn from these things, and you change how you do things, and apply that to different areas. And I think that can really open up new opportunities.
Okay. Well, let's say if A1, B1 don't yield a super high grade discovery, given that you say like 50% of the value is in there. Certainly with the next round of drilling, how quickly do you kind of shift focus to others like PLM, Broach, or Minto?
I think it's not as much of a shift in focus, and in that you would interpret that to mean that we're abandoning A1B1, which we aren't, but we do want to bring in new areas into the portfolio. And I think that PW, for instance, we're doing ground EM on that right now, and ground EM, you basically do it on grids or lines. You survey a line, you model it, you identify a conductor on that line. You do it on the next line over, you identify the conductor there, you draw a line between the two, and that's sort of how your conductor trend grows, right? Until you basically have dead lines. So that's how you get your little line of what a ground conductor line that's shown on a map. As soon as you do this first line and you see a great conductor, you can go and drill that right away. You don't have to wait for to do the whole grid. So I think that right now we're in the early stages of sort of receiving initial data from those lines. And I do see us going in there and testing these things out. We call them feeler holes. It's sort of your first pass hole. I don't think you would expect to drill into a high-grade pod on your first hole. You want to characterize the structure that corresponds to this conductor. So you kind of drill a more conservative hole, a bit deeper down where you don't want to overshoot it, right? You drill it where you know for sure it should be. Look at the structure. If it looks great, okay, so now you can kind of maybe walk it up closer to the unconformity and then walk it out along strike from there.
Right, okay. And I mean, sorry to kind of get into the weeds here. I'm just really intrigued by the hunt, as it were. If A1B1 was to host another uranium deposit, would you expect it to be quite similar in terms of grade, in terms of tonnage to JR zone? How do these deposits formed, and is there kind of uniformity to them?
No, I don't think so. I think the closest analog to JR zone in terms of the style of mineralization and the way it's hosted and the depth it's hosted and all that is probably Triple R. And at Triple R, we found the first zone we found there, or deposit, was called the R0 zone, which is on land. And that was, I don't remember, I think that was about 10 million pounds. The next zone over is R780 zone, sort of the main I don't know, it's over a kilometer long. And that hosts, I can't even really remember, it's like 80 some million pounds maybe. And then you have other little pods. You have 840 zone and 1515 zone. So these zones at Triple R, where you do have this chain of deposits, they vary from 6 million pounds to, 80 million pounds, right?
Right.
So I don't
Highly
think
variable.
because of JR zone of what it is, that if we find something else along strike, that it would necessarily be the same in size. I think that in terms of grade, it would be similar. And it probably would be similar, I would expect it sort of in depth extent. But in terms of length, I think that's wide open and not anything's possible for that.
Right. You mentioned some historic drilling, earlier in the conversation. I mean, how much historic drilling was done, and how much data is there on PLN, Broach, or Minto, and what's the kind of priority in which you would go chasing that?
I think there's been very little drilling outside. The vast majority of the drilling's been on A1B1. Broach, we've done very little drilling. We haven't at all drilled our new area that we like to be. It's called BRS, the Broach Lake South Conductor, sort of on the south edge of the lake. That's how it hasn't seen any drilling. PW has seen maybe 4 holes historically, none of them on the conductor, or where we think the conductor is going to be. And then the northern property, Minto, we have what we call the A4 grid that's had 1 hole in it.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Okay. So just in terms of the type of drilling that you've done and probably and going to be doing, in terms of these, is it relatively simple? Is it relatively efficient drilling? I don't know what depths you're chasing these things, or what methods you're using. Can you sort of talk through that?
So like I kind of touched on earlier, our challenge is the overburden. Diamond drills are made for coring hard rock, so that's what they excel at. When they have to drill through deep amounts of overburden, you lose a lot of drill holes, and you have a lot of drill hole deviation. That's why we use a sonic drill, which basically puts in casings and pre-drills all these holes on the JR zone. Because on the JR zone, when we're drilling 8-meter step outs, we need our holes to be very straight, right? On the exploration side, we're going to skip the sonic drill and go straight to diamond drilling to cut costs. And that sonic drilling is very expensive, right? So we'll drill the holes a bit steeper and flesh these things out on the first pass with a diamond drill alone. But in terms of technical difficulties, that's the west side of the basin is sort of unique for its overburden.
Right. So pre-casing method with a sonic rig, that's a little bit more expensive. And once you get a little bit deeper, you can go with conventional diamond.
Yep.
Is that the idea? Okay. Understood. So that's a kind of it'll get cheaper and faster, presumably.
I hope so. I mean, I think that it's a constant where the overburden is a constant in every hole. The other thing we have is our mineralization is very shallow. So it's basically not very deep beneath sort of the top of bedrock, right? You have all this overburden to get through, and then you're into the mineralization right away. If you look at the east side of the basin, where companies are drilling very deep holes, they're drilling 800-900 meter holes. They're able to do a mother hole and then sort of branch off of it, right, with the directional drilling. And even though the holes are quite deep, they're doing these offcuts, and so they're really only drilling 300-400 meter holes, right? And they don't have to go through deep overburden every time.
Right. Okay.
But that's just the way of the land.
Yeah, no, I get it. I was really just trying to understand it, because most people don't really think about it. They go, a drill's a drill, right?
Yeah.
Just in terms of maybe looking at some of the data utilization, interpretation, etc., like that. You mentioned obviously earlier scintillometers. I think that's a relatively new thing in the last 2-3 years that people have been introduced to. How do you sort of integrate those radioactivity readings into with the assay results to be able to refine drill targeting?
So the radioactivity, there's a couple ways you can measure it. First off is you can measure the radioactivity of the drill core. And the drill core is what you send to the lab, right? You split it in half. Half of that drill core sample goes to the lab. And so you can kind of directly correlate your SIL counts to assays of the drill core. And then you also have downhole probing as well, which is basically a scintillometer in a way that you lower down the drill hole and you probe the outside of the borehole, which is a slightly different thing from the core, right? Because it's two different things. One is sort of measuring what's outside of the drill hole, and the other one is the core itself. But typically drill core assays and drill core scintillometers results, they do correlate very well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. I mean, you mentioned sort of the assays outstanding. I mean, how are we talking about?
We're talking about 25 holes worth, probably something like 4,000 assays, or geochemistry rather.
Whoa. Okay. So when are they likely to come through?
Well, they're coming through slowly in batches. I think that the lab in Saskatchewan that everybody uses, SRC, they've received, I think they said this was the busiest year for them since 2013 or 14. 2013-14 was when Fission was drilling, Triple R and Arrow was drilling, or Next Gen was drilling Arrow, so they were getting a huge amount of samples from those two. And apparently they're on par to sort of match that this year. So it's just the volume. It's just the volume. Yeah.
Does that keeps the prices up as well, I guess, if they're busy? Yeah,
there's not really an alternative, right? There's SRC is the golden standard. I think they are the best at uranium analysis. We have sent samples to other labs for umpire, QA/QC, and I think the other labs can do it as well, but they're just not. They're not the trusted name,
Right. Okay.
And assay costs, especially in uranium, are quite significant. Like our geochemistry and assay costs are probably on a per meter basis for drilling are about half of what drilling costs.
Yeah. People forget that. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry to kind of get into the weeds with you, but you are the guy to answer these questions. I think better than some in your company. And so, just in terms of maybe focusing now, or highlighting, I should say, some short-term exploration milestones. What are you looking at in the next 3 to 6 months from you?
So next 3 to 6 months, I think that would be our winter program, which just kicked off. We're going to keep that going to breakup, so probably into first week of April when everything melts. In that time, I think we want to identify a new system, hopefully at PW, and kind of prioritize areas that require the cold weather for access. For example, a 4-conductor system we can access in the summer. So I don't think that I want to go there yet this winter, and focus on PW and probably some more drilling on B1.
Right. And what about this kind of getting to sort of economics now? It's like the thing that people will be looking for is to either understand how what you've got now can convert into a resource estimate by the end of the year, and if it stands alone, or do you need this sort of second sort of big discovery to kind of make it work?
Well, so JR Zone right now is not going to substantiate a standalone mine and mill. And I think that's what we're seeing. If you look at on the east side, you have Cameco operating their mines, which are central hubs that they feed all of their other deposits into for processing. Now on the west side, we have Paladin now, X-Fission. Paladin and NextGen are both proposing their own mills and mines, right? In sort of on the same time frame. So, we're not going to jump on that and propose a third one, right? I think that JR zone, in terms of size and grade, what probably would work best for it to be like a satellite operation sort of to a central milling location. It's close enough. It's 20, 30 kilometers away from wherever the new mill will be. I can't speak to its economics, but probably one thing you would be looking at would be to just high grade it and pull out what you can and ship it to a mill.
Yeah. I think we're still seeing a sort of changing pattern, and we're rethinking about a lot of companies in different metals, but how they come at the market, and the kind of cost capital has become a real core focus for most. So, well, look, Sam, thanks for running through that, better understanding of how you're coming after that. And obviously this year's a big year for you guys, for sure. Hopefully start to see some of these assays coming through, get a sense of what you're dealing with. Appreciate your time today.
Absolutely. Thank you.